Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming to this author event with Mike Trigg, author of BitFlip. Mike and Leslie are very good friends from college. Mike grew up in Appleton, Wisconsin, and stayed in the Midwest to go to college at Northwestern, where Danielle and I and Leslie also went. We'll talk about Northwestern a little more in a second. Mike got a business degree at UC Berkeley and worked in the Senate as an aide at one point, and then for most of his career worked in the Silicon Valley primarily as a marketing executive. Leslie is his wife, and his two boys are here, Cole and Chase, and they live in the Bay Area. So, as I said, Mike and Leslie and Danielle and I all went to Northwestern together. The three of them are a year younger than I am. And the most significant and important thing to know about Mike and Leslie is it was at their wedding where Danielle and I got reacquainted.
There we go. Full circle.
That must have been good dancing.
We're going to need more drinks.
The other thing that you should know about these guys is that they drove here from the Bay Area because they were supposed to fly in Southwest.
Yeah, here. Nice
So
effort.
yeah, all day in the car
I
yesterday.
got to get you off the beaten path by Thursday night. So we would not be denied.
Okay. So Mike has just written a book called BitFlip about life in the Silicon Valley. And we're going to talk about that book and then just talk about Mike's reading habits and about books in general. And then we'll have questions, and this is pretty informal and casual, so if you guys have questions
As
any point.
evidenced by the fact we're both drinking cocktails.
So, the most common advice that writers get is to write about what you know. You wrote about the Silicon Valley because you worked there for 20 years. When did you know that, your desire to write a book and the topics and themes that you were living, when did that all come together and motivate you to write BitFlip?
Well, I'll start with the fact that I've always wanted to write a novel. I took a creative writing class back at Northwestern and really enjoyed it. I decided I could not make a living being an author. I still believe I cannot make a living being an author, just to be clear. But it was kind of always in the back of my head. And I took that advice very much to heart of write what you know. As an entrepreneur, I've started a lot of companies, been at a lot of early stage startups. I look at things with an entrepreneur's mindset, and I looked at the copious amounts of nonfiction about Silicon Valley. There's a lot of memoirs and biographies and books about Apple and Google and Yahoo and everything else. There's a lot of media coverage about Silicon Valley, but I found very, very few novels about Silicon Valley. And that just struck me as kind of a market opportunity. I felt like, this is something that obviously there's a lot of interest in generally about tech and tech culture and everything that goes on there, as there is in Hollywood, Wall Street, a lot of other places, Washington, D.C., a lot of other places get a lot of fictionalized stories about those areas. And so I wanted to write a book. I just didn't see much that, to me, sort of authentically captured the experience that I had had for 20 plus years in Silicon Valley. And the book, the first scraps of an idea were honestly just little anecdotes that I'd share with Leslie when I'd get home. And I'd be like, oh my God, there was this meeting today and you won't believe what so-and-so said. And she would sort of say, you should write a book. You should write a book. This is funny, it's interesting, it's insightful about the culture of Silicon Valley. And so that was the initial grains of it. So.
All right. Well, yeah, and you did a really good job of focusing on the emotional aspects of life in Silicon Valley and the personal aspects, and not, certainly not focused on technology.
Yeah, no, and a lot of people ask that, oh, do you need to be a tech insider? And my goal was always to balance that, to have it feel authentic and credible to somebody who had spent their career in Silicon Valley, as I had, but to be accessible and interesting to somebody who has not. And the themes of the book really at the end of the day are about ambition and greed and love and very universally human emotions. So I think it struck that balance well.
Definitely. Well, and that leads into my next question, which is, which characters or themes did you feel good about giving a louder megaphone to?
Which characters?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
or ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I could go all day on this one. So obviously the protagonist, Sam Hughes, is not dissimilar from myself. I mean, he's kind of a middle-aged executive, C-level exec who's kind of been in the Valley, came out there during the dot-com boom with a lot of, big ambitions about how he's going to make the world a better place, but also make a ton of money. There's this weird element to Silicon Valley where, for the longest time, I think this bubble is starting to burst for people, but they'd sort of rationalize the greed with, well, we're making the world a better place. Like that was a motto, that was a refrain that you hear from so many startup companies, and some legitimately are, but many are not really. And so, I think in terms of characters, so Sam really represents somebody who came with the best of intentions, but the system, the structure of Silicon Valley ultimately sort of, leads him astray. And can his moral compass survive the situation and the pressures of a career in Silicon Valley? But there's a lot of characters in there that are representative of different things. In fact, if you want to really geek out on the book, there are characters that represent each of the 7 deadly sins. So there's a character who I described as kind of his anti-mentor, named Peter Green, who's this, Midas touch billionaire. Like everything he's ever invested in or done has just been a huge success. And so he obviously represents greed. There's Sam, for his part, main protagonist is envy. There's a character who's kind of this obese philanthropist who's gluttony. So there's different characters in the book represent sort of each of those deadly sins, and I think that's a little of what I was trying to represent in the book, is that there are those forces manifested in the culture of Silicon Valley.
That's cool. I wish I.
You got to read it again. Read it again.
Well, which character, and any character, not necessarily one that represents one of the 7 sins, which character was most difficult to write?
I had to look up the 7 deadly sins. I was like, hey, what are they?
That's a good sign.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the hardest one to write was Sam, because, in the spirit of write what you know, a lot of the scenes and situations were ones, the book's definitely a work of fiction. I didn't really experience, live through a company where there was fraud discovered or anything nefarious like that. But a lot of those were
as far as you know,
as far as I know, adjacent to situations that I lived myself, and I saw a lot of myself in Sam as I sort of was initially writing the book. And Sam doesn't turn out to be the best actor, I guess I'd say. And that part was a little harder for me, right? Like the I don't want to spoil the ending, so I'm not going to talk about how his character ultimately evolves. But some of his, some of the things that I would never do, that I had Sam do, were sort of hard to, felt a little icky a little bit. It just sort of, that was when I really had to, as an author, for the first time, sort of disassociate. Okay, this is not me. I'm not writing a memoir. I'm not writing an autobiography. I am writing a piece of fiction. Sam can do whatever the hell he wants. I won't judge him. And so he was probably one of the harder ones to write. And then, I think I tried to have a sensitivity throughout the novel where, again, I wanted authenticity in the book. But I didn't want to didn't want to feel like I was dealing in stereotypes either. And so there are definitely characters and topics that are sensitive, and they're hard to write about. One of the female characters experiences a sexual assault, and so getting that right as an author, especially as a male author, you're like, but that's part of Silicon Valley, unfortunately. There have been companies and incidents, and I had the misfortune of being at a company where there was an incident, and I felt like I can't not talk about that since it's a huge issue. Women are underrepresented in the tech industry substantially, especially in more technical STEM type roles. Sexual harassment and assault are unfortunately, have happened with prominent people in prominent firms. And so that, to me, is part of the negative of Silicon Valley, and I felt like that had to be in there, even though it was hard to write about.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I was pretty sure your answer was going to be Sam's wife, just because, for the reasons that you kind of touched on, just as a male, it's hard to develop female characters. But I think you're right that getting Sam right was certainly key for the whole plotline. So, how would your book be different? How differently would Silicon Valley be characterized if you had written this book 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
10 years ago, well, there's definitely been an arc to Silicon Valley, the narrative of Silicon Valley. You rewind the clock to the early 80s and the advent of the PC and Windows and Intel, and then of course the .com era, and there have been these sort of waves of technology that have had a very, I'd say, generally positive coverage of them. If you read media coverage back in that time, it's like, these guys are changing the world and making it a better place, and it was very much a drink the Kool-Aid kind of thing, and it was viewed as sort of a David versus Goliath fight, right? Like, we're going to disintermediate the old monopolistic guard and whatnot, and then you blink and 10 years pass, and that is those are the oligopolists, right? Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. These are the biggest corporations.
I don't like to say the A word in this story.
Yeah, exactly. The a-holes, right? Right? They have become what they ranted against for so long. All these tech companies. You look at the wealthiest people in the world. They're almost exclusively technology people, or oil sheiks, and so it pretty quickly, over the last 10 years, the narrative kind of flipped. You started hearing terms like big tech. You started, people started getting understandably and justifiably upset about the disproportionate role that technology had in their lives, and increasingly sort of suspicious of the data that was being collected and everything else. And that has been, I've talked a lot about that, especially at book events in the Bay Area, of kind of this identity crisis that I think the Bay Area is going through right now, where all of a sudden people in the tech world who are like, we're making the world a better place, we're all of a sudden like, wait, we're accomplices to some really bad stuff. And it, talk about a year, we're almost December 31st. This has been a bad year for tech. Twitter, FTX, there have been scandals and cons and frauds on an unprecedented scale. And I think it's really coming home to roost. I think the book came out, fortunately, for me, at a good time, where just suddenly, I think if I'd written it 10 years ago, I think people would have been like, oh, tech are the good guys, right? Like, why are you talking about these negative aspects of this industry? And now people are interested in learning, like, why is that? Why has that happened? So that's a lot of what I opine about on my blog as well.
All right. What's the most interesting or surprising feedback you've received since the book's been published?
I'd say the most interesting feedback.
These dudes want to get a copy of it.
I mean, signings happening.
Early readers.
I don't have the picture book version. I don't know, interesting feedback. I'd say the most feedback has been about the ending. So maybe I'll tease you to read the book by saying the ending was surprising, was unexpected, was a little bit controversial. I've had some people, I did a book group, like, there was a group of women who read a book a month and get together to talk about it, and so I joined the book group. And one of the people in the book group was like, really upset about the ending, like was taking me to task about the ending of the book, and I said, look, I get that it might be unsettling, I get that it might not be a happy ending, but it did service to the book. The book is meant to be sort of a cautionary tale, and if it ends as a happy, a happy ending, it's less cautionary. So that's probably been where I've gotten the most feedback.
All right. Since we are here in a bookstore, I would now like to ask you some questions about what you like to read and how that informed your writing process. So what books are on your nightstand right now?
I am currently reading, I just finished a book I highly recommend named Demon Copperfield by Barbara Kingsolver. I thought that was excellent.
We're sold out.
You're sold out. Very good. All right.
Oh my God.
I read a book of hers ages ago. It was probably one of the first pieces of fiction that I really loved, and I, of course, I can't even remember the name off the top of my head, but
Something by it, right?
yeah, something.
Poison with Bible.
Poison.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, right.
So that is still on my nightstand, although I have finished it. By the way, if anybody, I am a avid Goodreads poster, so everything
I know. That's how I.
is Goodreads evil too? I know
Well,
they're
they're
owned by
on
Amazon,
Amazon, but it's okay.
They're
I'm on
pretty
Goodreads too.
so you'll accept it.
I'll accept it.
So everything's on there. I
Mike
write.
motivated.
What's that?
You actually motivated me last year because Mike posted on Goodreads you can set a goal for the year. And
Yes.
you set a goal.
I did.
And you posted it. And so then because of you, I set a goal, which I am glad to say I met. It wasn't as big as your goal though.
I mean, I'm reading the
But I
book
did buy a
right now.
bookstore.
That'll be
Yeah,
my
I think that
52nd book. So I've 2 years in a row now set a goal and met a goal of reading a novel a week.
Yeah,
That's
so was yours 50 or 52?
52. I mean, there are 52 weeks.
I know,
in a year.
I thought maybe you broke it down.
I can't. I don't take a week off, Danielle. I don't take a week off. Now, to be fair, that includes audiobooks, so I'm just full disclosure. But I'm reading it right now, and it was my bad for not looking it up my Goodreads. The book is called Notes on an Execution. No, I don't have it. My phone is being used for phone.
Oh, right.
It's called Notes on an Execution. I'm blanking on the author's name, but it's very good. It's very interesting. I'm also reading the latest John Grisham novel, Boys of Biloxi, I think it's called. Not a strong recommend. It's interesting, more historical fiction. I like more contemporary stuff.
All right. What's the last great book you read?
The Demon Copperfield was very good. Another one I'd recommend, and I'm again blanking on the author's name, but Young Mungo was very good. It's a kind of a coming of age story about an impoverished kid growing up in Scotland, in Glasgow, who is gay and sort of going through that discovery. So that was very good that I read recently. I do a best 5 books of the year, so I'm actively thinking about what my top 5 are going to be. So I don't want to spoil it, but those 2 will be on there.
Well,
Yeah, those are all
yeah,
nice.
Harris.
Do you prefer fiction or nonfiction?
Well, I read both. So I've kind of flipped on this a little bit. I would say that, broad strokes generalization, men tend to read more nonfiction and women tend to read a little more fiction. And so I like a lot of male readers, especially in tech. I read a lot of nonfiction tech books. Like, I've got to learn something. Like, this has got to be. So I my pre-novel writing reading list would have been much more heavily nonfiction. Now, to meet the 52 novel reading goal, I read a shitload of fiction. And I love it. I think fiction gets a bad rap because I don't know, maybe this is a Silicon Valley or a tech thing, but like, people feel like it's sort of frivolous, or I'm not using my time well to read fiction, or some odd perception like that. I think I used to have that perception. Now I feel like fiction is the best, perhaps only way to build true empathy, right? Like, you can live another person's life through like this story of young Mungo. Like, it gave me tremendous empathy to what it would be like to be homosexual in that day and age, that like you don't get that really any other way. And so I would further posit that the world could use a lot more empathy. So I think that reading fiction is great. So I forget what your original question was. I think I got way off.
Just fiction, nonfiction.
Yeah, I read both. I read a lot of the nonfiction that I read now is, I'd almost categorize as research. It's kind of like informing books I want to write. And so in areas where I want to, for my next book, I've needed to learn a fair amount about the criminal justice system, the FBI. Like, you got to brush up. I didn't know much about that sort of stuff. So
I agree with you that generally, men read nonfiction over fiction, but like, I've always been more of a fan of fiction, mainly because like with nonfiction, like, I know how that book's going to end.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And agree. And I've gotten into many discussions with, because I work in an industry too that's very male dominated, and actually reading is not very prevalent in construction, but to the people who do read, certainly tend to nonfiction. But the argument that I've always given is that fiction makes you a better business leader.
Absolutely.
Because of the empathy point.
Well, in an area where a lot of my favorite books are kind of cross over. They're like narrative nonfiction, like Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, which was the story of Theranos and the scandal there. I read a fantastic novel. I mean, I'm probably ruining your next question, but my next book is about a sort of a online agitator, and I read a great book called American Kingpin about a 20-something kid who ended up setting up this site called Silk Road, which kind of doesn't exist anymore, but it was a site. It was Amazon for everything illicit, drugs, sex, guns. He just had this extreme sort of libertarian viewpoint that people should be able to buy and sell whatever they want. Like, anyway, so that was that was a really interesting book, and I like books like that kind of they tell a story, right? And good media, good journalism does that too.
Are there any classics that you only recently read for the first time?
No, I guess not read for the first time. I recently reread Great Gatsby, but I read it so long ago it might as well have been for the first time.
I have it.
You have it. Great. That was also kind of research. My next book is I recognize I had enough memories of the plot of Great Gatsby to kind of be inspired by that, and was thinking about an idea, and so I really wanted to understand that book. If you've read it and remember it, it has a unique narrative structure where the protagonist, Gatsby, is like not the narrator, right? The narrator is the next door neighbor, the kid who kind of gets sucked into his circle, and I just as an author, I just thought, oh, that's a really interesting point of view where you're kind of at the periphery of this really interesting character, and how do you, how does that create opportunities for you as a writer to tell the story in a different way than you would if you were telling it through Gatsby's voice? So, reread it.
All right. Describe your ideal reading experience. Where are you?
Well, my ideal reading experience, I've gotten really into this. Is so geeky. I'm embarrassed to say it, but I'll buy the book and I'll buy the audiobook as well, and I tag team through the story.
Oh, okay.
And so I read at night every night. Drives Leslie crazy because I have like a reading light and glasses and like bifocals, and it's
luck.
quite a lot of contraptions that are required at my age to actually read in the dark. But so I'll read a little bit every night. I read when I get windows of time, on a plane. But then, you live in the Bay Area, you drive a lot. I happen to have driven 20 hours in the last 48 hours. And, I used to sort of read a book and have an audiobook and they'd be different. And you can actually do that pretty well. I find I retain a lot from the audiobooks, maybe even more. Maybe I'm more an auditory learner. But my best mode now, I really like that exchange. And I find the story sticks with me better for some reason. Maybe it's because it's activating multiple senses.
Right.
And maybe it's because you can get through a book in just a shorter period of time. So that's probably my favorite mode, the hybrid mode. I wish more books would do that. Have kind of a, you can buy the ebook, you buy the audiobook, you buy the paperback and the hardcover. Kind of wish you could buy like a package of like a little bit more to get like the ebook and the audiobook. I don't know. Maybe there's probably something out there that does that. But.
Wait, so I'm curious about that. Like if you're like reading the ebook,
Yeah.
then but then you get into the car, does it like bring you to the exact spot?
Well, no, I have to babysit it a little
Okay.
bit. That's another good part about it though, because it sort of gives you that little extra push to like get to the end of the chapter, because then it's a lot easier to like, I'm gonna just pop to chapter 12 or whatever.
They
wherever I
are
left
word
off.
for word, though, right?
It's word for
I've
word.
never
yeah.
done both. I was like, that's ridiculous.
It's word for word.
Yeah.
It seems like soon enough, like the technology will catch up.
Yeah, I
with
think
it.
we're gonna get there.
What's your favorite book that no one else has heard of?
You previewed these questions for me, Mike, and if I'd been not in the car for the last 20 hours, I'd have better answers queued up. for
Don't
you.
worry, we haven't heard of a lot of books. So
That's a great guess.
Great Gatsby.
What was it?
Boy, you may have already answered that with Young Mungo.
Yeah. No, I mean that's probably one not a lot of people have heard.
Trying to help out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you need-
I'd never heard of it.
I read, one of the books that I was surprised I liked so much, it was on my top 5 list last year, was called Animal by Lisa Taddeo. Leslie had actually read it before I did.
3 Women right there.
Oh.
You have 3
Yeah,
Women.
she went through and
That was a great book.
I didn't sort of expect to like it, but I thought it was very good. I don't know that I can summarize it really quickly, but I think that's one that maybe people wouldn't expect. How would you, I don't know how to best describe it. It's just sort of a very assertive, aggressive, almost reckless protagonist and female protagonist. And I don't think there aren't quite enough like female lead stories like that where she's just reckless is sort of the word that comes to mind, and versus sort of composed or insecure or other female stereotypes that you see in literature more often.
Hey, Mike and Mike. Before your last questions, I know that both the bar and the book selling side are going to close up in a couple minutes.
Oh, okay.
But it would just mean we have to. It just means that if anyone wants to get another
She's always looking
drink,
for that dollar.
Yeah.
drinks or books, there's more down. If you want to buy a book, because then I think Mike Trigg might be available to do some signing.
I got
He's already
stuck.
signed one.
Fat stack.
There's books downstairs or there's drinks downstairs, but
Perfect.
I know that they're gonna like close up the cash registers in a few.
15 minutes.
So you don't know
15
how to.
minutes, okay.
You don't know how to.
What?
If anyone,
Extend
You can't
the
sell books.
You
can take a drink break.
Why don't we wrap the program in 5-10 minutes,
Okay.
and we can sign and get everybody out. And then I'm happy to linger, and if people want to have questions.
Yeah, and you actually have answered a lot of my questions, like with your other responses.
I have a tendency to do that.
So, what were you reading when you were writing this book?
Writing this book?
Yeah.
Well, you know, the whole process took like 5 years, so I read a lot of books. You know, again, I was reading a lot of nonfiction. I think you know, I don't want to veer us into a political discussion, but during the previous presidential administration, I read a lot of nonfiction, political nonfiction. You mentioned I used to work on Capitol Hill. I sort of got sucked into the vortex on that a little bit, and you know, frankly, it's been a blessing to sort of just free up my time a little bit to read other stuff that isn't so sky is falling. So I was reading a lot of that, and then I read a lot of you know, tech nonfiction. Right? There's a whole ecosystem of books. Many of them basically should be titled "How to Get Rich in Tech" because that's really what they're writing about, right? Whether it's an autobiography on, you know, or a biography. I mean, that's the fascination of the tech industry in a nutshell, I think, unfortunately, is that it has created fantastical wealth beyond comprehension instantaneously, or, you know, very close to instantaneously. And that's lured people to Silicon Valley to be part of that ecosystem. That's part of what people find fascinating and repulsive about it. And so many of the books about, you know, whether it's management books, business books, biographies, corporate histories, whatever they are, that's always kind of the story. It's like, it was so incredible and it was just so crazy and we were growing so fast and, you know, we all became millionaires and you know, that's a lot of what this book was meant to be, is to just poke a hole in that mythos a little bit.
Well, tell us a little bit about your next book, Burner,
Yeah.
which I've had the pleasure of reading an advanced draft of it, and it's as good, if not better, than BitFlip. You definitely learned from this process and applied that.
Yes.
And then I also heard you mention that you're already
A
thinking
book
about
after
your
the
third
book.
one.
Yeah. So, Burner, working title, little teaser on my website, is also kind of my lane is, as you might guess, tech industry and its impact on our lives. And so this book was about sort of insider, a person working at a tech company. The second book, Burner, is about a tech kind of super user. So there's dual first person narrative through the book, male protagonist, female protagonist. The male protagonist, Shane, is this kind of idiot savant. He grew up poor, grew up in foster care, really challenging upbringing, kind of becomes a bit of a hustler, and ends up creating this online persona and following anonymously that is sort of politically motivated. The female protagonist, Chloe, is an Instagram sort of celebrity. She's the daughter of a tech billionaire and you know, philanthropist and everything else, and they are secretly in love. And the book opens with Shane getting arrested for treason and Chloe getting abducted by Shane's followers who don't know that they're in a relationship. So that's sort of the jumping off point for a little bit more. It's I describe it as a corporate thriller. It's not too many people die in it, though. You know, usually to really have a thriller title, there needs to be a little more life and death. This book's a little more life and death, this next one. And then, you know, the book after that, I don't have even a working name yet. But it is based on, you know, these characters. I mean, Elon Musk would be the most current, outrageous, you know, archetype of this persona. where they're sort of just they become these sort of larger than life people, and they have ecosystems of yes men, for lack of a better term, who tell them everything's great, tell them they're great. You know, they live in this very much this bubble. And there's actually another character it's based on a real person is Tony Hsieh, who was the founder of Zappos and died tragically and sort of infamously had, you know, just surrounded himself with sort of sycophantic people who just, you know, leached off him for a long, long time. And so it's based on a character kind of like that. Again, Great Gatsby-esque, told by the person doing the leeching, who's kind of gotten sucked into his ecosystem. So that, but I don't have a working title or very much on paper for that one yet. So,
Well, and you've mentioned your blog a couple times.
yeah. So
Give the
MikeTrigg,
address.
yeah, MikeTrigg.com, easy to remember. I post a lot. Some are good, some are just, you know, drivel. But it keeps the creative juices flowing. And then, you know, there's information about my books. There's information about events. We'll post the video for this there. So
We'll get to hear your top 5 of 20.
it'll be. I haven't written it yet. I have books to finish. I have 2 books to finish before I.
Before the 31st?
Yes. I got some reading to do. I have my night goggles on.
Long drive.
Yeah, exactly. So.
All right.
There's one right here.
Mike
It's
Trigg.
like, no, it's the whole life, and accomplishments of the Dalai Lama.
Yeah, I've
It was
got,
pretty good.
that's
It's
next.
like the whole thing. That's all
next
this guy
time I
did.
did
Look
read.
at that. That's it.
Too funny.
That's really
Any
funny.
other
And it's only
questions?
$3.
Wait, are you writing full time now? So out of the other career?
I am.
All the,
I am.
I want to make
And
sure you're
you might
working
ask,
and
how do I
reading.
support myself? My wife
That would
works
be
full
Leslie.
time.
Thank you,
Yes,
Leslie.
exactly.
Shout out to
So,
Leslie.
I am, and this was a COVID thing for me. I was working on a startup, and we had to pivot when COVID happened, and then it was hard to raise money, and so we kind of decided to wind it down. And I'd written first drafts of the book prior to that, but I was like, all right, I'm not quitting a job, I'm not giving up an income, I'm already kind of sequestered at home, and you know, if I'm ever going to take the plunge and write full time, now's the time to do it. So I did that, you know, coming on 2 years ago now, and
3.
no, well, what for COVID?
Well, yeah.
When I took the plunge about 2
Okay,
years ago.
gotcha.
So yes.
Cool.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is
I
it
wanted to
true that Mike is being considered as the narrator on the Burner audiobook?
He'd be a great narrator.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got that deep, sultry voice, like, you know, very believable, like, you know.
My dad in his prime would have been.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I would.
Maybe you'll do the Spanish version.
I do actually. We did record an audiobook version of it as well. So I'm such a big audiobook fan. I was like, we've
Did
got to
you
have
read
an
it?
audiobook. No, well, I did. So I read my whole book and recorded it. Nobody's ever going to listen to that. It's awful.
These 3 had to listen to it.
No, they didn't. And not even they were subjected to it. I realized I don't have a good voice for, and I can't do a good audio book narrator.
Skill.
They can act. They're an actor. Like the person I ended up working with, he's a classically trained actor, theater actor, and he does the voices, and you don't cringe or like they don't sound like. I could never do the voices of all the characters in the book. So it's a distinct skill for sure. I recorded it because I was told that a good way to find typos in your final manuscript is to read the book out loud. So I thought if I'm going to go through the trouble of reading it out loud, I might as well record it just in case. And I was like, that's never going anywhere.
Did you find any typos?
Yes, I did. And I found typos. There are, I think, up to 3 in this book that
I'll
I've
let you
found. It's amazing how hard it is to get them all.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
this is perfect break time, right?
Mike Trigg,
Okay.
thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.